if we create conscious systems, that's really when we start playing God.
The next conversation, we again are going to get to the heart of the matter of what we've been discussing the whole day and will be for the next day and a half, is what is consciousness? You know, what is this ineffable thing that does distinguish us? When machines are learning to see, they're learning to speak, they're learning to reason, they're learning to move, they're learning to amalgamate that, they're having emergent properties. What then is distinctive about being human? What is this consciousness that thousands of years of religion and spirituality and science and physics have grappled with and not yet come to a conclusion about? There is somebody who's engaged with this very, very deeply. He's written a book very evocatively called Being You. He's admired by scientists and peers across the world, and we are really delighted to have with us Anil Seth. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage neuroscientist Anil Seth.
Oh, hello, thank you. That was a wonderful video, really impressive.
Thank you, Anil. So, Anil, again, this is such a massive, topic to unpack that I'd like to just give the audience a tiny bit of context that, as neuroscientists and philosophers and spiritualists and technologists have tried to grapple with this idea of what is consciousness. Famously, one of the neuroscientists, philosopher, David Chalmers, came up with a phrase that has stuck in sort of scientific consciousness, which is that there's a hard problem of consciousness, that how does all these sort of chemicals and physical processes and these gooey things, that, including bacteria that our body is made of, give rise to this extremely keenly subjective sense of self that we all identify with. I as Shoma, he is Anil, and each of you as yourselves. And then Anil took a completely different route, and he said, let's forget about the hard problem of consciousness, and let's come to the real problem of consciousness. So that's what's so distinctive about Anil, and why he's really carved a space in, as I said, scientific consciousness. So with that, Anil, in the shortest way possible, help the audience understand what you mean by the real problem of consciousness and break that down to its 3 or 4 very key constituents.
Sure. So, you described the hard problem beautifully. It's the problem that's been with us forever. On the one hand, we seem to have matter stuff, maybe very complicated matter in the brain. And on the other, we have experiences of redness, of taste, of emotion. And it's puzzled philosophers and thinkers, I think in all cultural traditions for thousands of years, how you can explain the one in terms of the other. And Dave Chalmers coined this the hard problem, and you're right, it's stuck. And in response to that problem, because it really does seem challenging, it doesn't seem as though any kind of explanation in terms of physics could explain the taste of red wine, right? So in the face of this mystery, a lot of very dramatic responses were proposed. Consciousness is fundamental and everywhere, panpsychism. Or consciousness doesn't even exist. Some people would say that. And I guess my approach was kind of pragmatic. Accept that consciousness exists, and which, by the way, I think all these things resist really tight definitions, but we all know what consciousness is. It's what we lose when we go under general anesthesia, and what comes back when we come round again. And it's the experiential aspect, the redness of red, the taste of a taste. Accept that consciousness exists, and instead of trying to explain how consciousness relates to matter as a single mystery, just break it down into its different properties and try to account for those properties. Now, that sounds a bit weird and abstract, but a good parallel to understand the approach is how biologists came to understand life. So 150 years ago, many people were convinced that life couldn't be explained in terms of physics and chemistry. But now that sense of mystery has gone away, and not because people found the spark of life or pretended that life doesn't exist, but they broke it down into different things like metabolism and reproduction and homeostasis, and explained those things. And little by little, the hard problem of life wasn't solved, but it was dissolved. And that's what I think we can do with consciousness. No eureka solution, but a steady, quite slow, but steady dissolution of this sense of mystery, and with that, a greater appreciation of how we relate to the world around us.
So, Anil, you know, it's amazing you brought that parallel that up until, like you said, 150 years ago, people thought life itself was mysterious. And now we have scientists who are literally birthing life and virtual cells, new life forms, xenobots. You know, we're going to be speaking with George Church, with Mike Levin, Elena Segriva, amazing scientists who are literally stretching the idea of playing God because they are birthing new life forms that are following a purpose, you know, and a goal and are able to act. But in that, you know, at a time when we are discussing whether there's consciousness in machines and consciousness in humans, what is your understanding of consciousness? I get it that you are saying that there are some real problems and let's dissolve. So it's level of consciousness, content of consciousness, and then the self idea of consciousness. You know, you've used this phrase that we're a predictive machine. Our brain is a predictive machine. We're in a controlled hallucination. So explain that to the audience on a Saturday afternoon in the most plausible ways.
So this word hallucination always gets me into trouble. You know, it's like maybe everything is made up. And I'm not saying that at all. And the control is just as important. So I think a good way to understand this is to break down this big mystery of consciousness into these three parts. What happens when we lose it entirely? But also, when we are conscious, how do we understand the nature of our perceptual experience of a world full of objects and people and places, and then within that, the experience of being a self? And the key idea here is this idea of the brain as a prediction machine. I think the easiest way to understand it is to imagine that you are your brain. It's kind of weird, but imagine you're there inside your skull. Now, it's dark in there, it's quiet, there's no sound, there's no light, there's no color. All the brain has to go on are sensory signals, electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to what's out there in the world or in the body. And so the brain has to make sense of these signals. And the way it does so, at least this is what the theory says, and it's an old idea, it's not mine, that the brain is always making predictions about the causes of the sensory signal, so making predictions about what's in the world and in the body, and then using sensory signals to update the predictions. So we don't read the world out. The brain is actively interpreting, constructing the world in this dance of prediction and prediction error coming from the outside in. So that's why I call it a controlled hallucination, because the brain is actively generating our experiences, not passively registering an objective reality.
So, Anil, I just wanted to share a little bit with the audience because, I mean, we've studied you, so it's more, understandable. But, the team saw me one entire day, like, leafing through Anil's book and saying, how does this make sense? You know, because when you say that all of reality is a controlled hallucination, I was like really enraged and I said, what is Anil saying? Is he saying this doesn't exist? How come all of us believe in the same hallucination then? And then it's not subjective. And there were all these questions that are going on. But Anil has been doing these tests about perceptual diversity to show that, the brain, as he said, is predicting what the color is. The color isn't what we see, and that's the easiest one to understand, that we are in our sort of sensory spectrum. We see a blue, it's not really blue. We see a red, it's not really a red. We understand that, Anil. But you take it one degree further, and you're saying that, say, we have an out-of-body experience, or we can swap bodies, and that evolution has taught our brain to see the world in a way which is useful to us rather than as it really is, And we understand that through color. But why should evolution have taught us to see the world like this? Like, what's the usefulness of seeing it like this?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's this old phrase in biology that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. So since consciousness is such a central feature of who and what we are, it does make sense to ask, well, what is it useful for? Why are our experiences constructed in the way they are, experiences of the world and of the self? And for any single kind of experience, you can come up with an answer. Like color, again, is good. Color, to experience color is a very convenient way for the brain to keep track of objects as lighting conditions change. You take a piece of paper from in here to outside, it still looks the same, white, even though the light coming into your eye from it is going to be very different. So you can have a single story for anything, but then what consciousness, I think, really enables for creatures like us is it brings together an awful lot of information about the world from many, many different senses in a format that immediately is sort of centered on the organism, this meat machine that we each are, what we can do, how we can behave in ways that are likely to help us stay alive. We experience emotions alongside an experience of the world, alongside opportunities for action. And so consciousness is this brilliant, efficient, effective way by which the brain can navigate a very complex world and a very complex set of possible behaviors within that world.
So, Anil, I'm not sure how much the audience will understand this unless they read your book and see your experiments.
We'll try.
So, when you're saying, let's take a couple of actual experiments you've done, because that also then will link up. You're saying that you have to be alive to be conscious. It's a biological, that you have to be biologically alive. Whereas, say, for instance, Eddie was saying in the Eastern traditions, they believe that you may not understand it, you may not comprehend it, or even experience the self or consciousness after you're dead, but it exists. You're saying you need to be biologically alive even to have it. So I want to take two mystical experiences, which is the out-of-body experience. When mystics say that they've had an out-of-body experience, that shows you the self exists outside of the body. You've done an experiment which shows that even that is biological. Share that with the audience.
It's a good example, and I think there's an important frame for this, though, which is that experiences, especially deeply powerful, mystical, spiritual experiences, are incredibly meaningful for the people that have them. And there can be this tendency for neuroscientists like me to sort of dismiss them and say, oh no, you're wrong, it's just like neurons firing in a weird way. And I think that's not the right response. We should take experiences that people have seriously, even though we don't necessarily take them literally. They have deep meaning for the people that have them. Now, having said that, out-of-body experiences are a great example, because on the face of it, they do seem to suggest that, my consciousness can leave my body and go sort of floating around, or just be not within where it normally is, because that's what the experience is like. So you can take it literally like that. And if that's true, then you face a big challenge in saying, okay, well, not only how can consciousness leave its normal domain of the brain, but how can it see anything? It doesn't have eyes, and there's all sorts of other problems. Maybe there's another explanation. And the other explanation is, for me, just much more interesting, which is that, the everyday experience that I have of being within my body or within my head is not something to take for granted. It's not where my consciousness is. It's something the brain is actively constructing every moment of every day. It's figuring out where the self is in relation to the world. And so these out-of-body experiences, they reflect that the brain's prediction of where the self is as going wrong in some way, or just being different in some way, not necessarily wrong. And the evidence that speaks to that is that we can induce out-of-body-like experiences in the lab. And people have been doing this for decades by sticking electrodes in the brain and turning activity in various areas. But you can do it with things like virtual reality. You can have people wear virtual reality goggles, and then you can have the input to the VR come from a camera positioned, let's say, behind the person's body. So the person is looking at themselves from a third-person perspective. And that can, for some people, in the right circumstances, induce a strange feeling of, it's called autoscopy. So you feel that your perspective is not in your body anymore. And so I think the fact that you can do this...
Just to say that again, that's like body swapping. You feel that you've swapped bodies, you're not there anymore?
Well, that's slightly different. So
Oh,
you can see yourself from outside, or I think the more fun one you can do is indeed this body swapping one, where you and I might wear a virtual reality headset each, and we each have cameras on it. And so initially I'll see you through the camera on my headset, and you will see me. But then we can just press a button and swap the feeds, so that now you see you from where I am, and likewise, I see me from where you are. But the critical thing there is the brain takes very seriously situations when multiple ways of sensing line up. So if we were then to shake hands, let's do it, right? Then that's when the illusion can become very powerful. And I've tried this multiple times, and it's a very strange thing. I know that I'm still on my seat, but it feels somehow that I'm in your body.
In my body,
Yeah.
and shaking hands with yourself.
Yes, exactly. Shaking hands with me, but I am you.
So you said earlier about even this out of body, that if you put an electric impulse in your neocortex, that you get this out of body experience, that you're not there, you get this body swapping. So that basically shows then that there is it's all in your brain, it's neuron systems, it's biological. So then my question to you is, is it integrated systems that, parts of your brain talk to each other, there's, stimuli. So then is it possible that AI systems could also become conscious? Because, like we said, they're learning to reason, they're learning to see, they're learning to move. So what's distinctive then?
I mean, this is really, I think, a very urgent question for today. And we've heard a lot of interesting perspectives on this already, maybe a little bit indirectly. But it's a question that's very much front and center because of all the ethical implications that would follow. If you mentioned playing God earlier by Mike Levin, making little living creatures. But it's really, if we create conscious systems, that's really when we start playing God, I think. And the way AI is developing, I think, encourages us to project qualities like consciousness into these systems very easily. I mean, we are very, very anthropocentric creatures, which means we tend to put ourselves at the top of every pile and at the center of everything and think we're special. And we are special in some ways. But maybe we're not that special. Copernicus showed we're not the center of the universe, and Darwin that we're related to all other animals. So maybe the same is true with consciousness. And if we take things like language and intelligence as indicators of consciousness, then we're making the mistake, I think, of being seduced by our psychological biases. These are things that go together with consciousness in us, human beings, but they don't go together in general. I mean, consciousness, having an experience like pain, is not the same thing as intelligence. They're just two different concepts. And so in AI, we might have a situation where systems can mimic things that are indicative of consciousness in ours, but really, there's just simulation and mimicry, and that it doesn't feel like anything to be a chatbot. Just one more thing on this. I mean, Pushmeet was up just earlier, and this brilliant work with AlphaFold. And one thing I've always found interesting is that there's this continual discussion on the internet all the time about whether language models are conscious, like Claude or GPT or now DeepSeek. But I don't think I've heard ever anybody make the claim that AlphaFold is conscious. Yet, as Pushmeet will tell you, it's not exactly the same as a language model, but it's not that different. Under the hood, it's very similar to a language model. Yet, no one thinks it's conscious. And to me, that suggests that when we feel that an AI system is conscious, it's our projections that are doing the work. It's not an insight into how things actually are.
No, but the distinction you make there is that Pushmeet's AlphaFold is doing a mathematical calculation and predicting protein structure, whereas ChatGPT and others are using language. So then you feel that it's very akin to ourselves, whereas it could be the same underlying structure that's doing it, but this is language and that's calculation. Yeah. So you don't feel that kinship. But Tell me, Anil, and I asked you this earlier, but I'm sure the audience is wondering as well. Why does this matter?
Yeah, it's what is it?
Like, and especially if you're saying it's not a spiritual thing, then why does it matter? Then we might as well become machines. Like, what's your proposition?
Well, it depends what you mean by machine. Some people use it in this very dismissive and derogatory way. Like, if we're nothing but machines, then that drains all the beauty and meaning out of being human. I think that's really doing an injustice to what a machine is. We are marvels of biological complexity. Every cell, every neuron you can think of it as a machine, but it's not like the kinds of machines that we build in factories, or whether they make computers or robots or whatever. So machines just complex feats of biology in our sense. And why does that matter? Well, I think two ways to think about it. Whether AI is conscious matters very strongly ethically. So there are two possibilities. Either it is or it isn't, or it will be or it won't be. And this does matter because as soon as something is conscious, it has moral status. We need to take its interest into account, which will make all the problems with AI much, much harder. And we want to avoid introducing new forms of suffering that we might not even recognize. So I think we should not even be trying to build conscious machines. It's not a morally sensible goal to have. But even if they're not conscious, but they just seem to us to be conscious, that's also ethically tricky, but in a more subtle way, because then we're faced with a choice. Either we treat them as if they are conscious, even though we know they're not, and that means that we'll expend moral capital on things that don't really need it, and because of our tendency to you're either in or you're out, we might treat other things worse. Or we decide to not care about these things, even though we still feel they feel. And that's just a very psychologically unhealthy thing to do. It brutalizes our minds, as Kant said long ago. So we're on the horns of a dilemma here, which I think can be resolved actually by thinking more carefully about the kind of AI that we want. Do we really want AI which has the goal of being maximally human-like? Now, there are some benefits in technology that seems human-like. It might allow more fluent interaction and so on. But we need to think very carefully. Shouldn't be a goal in itself, because it risks seducing us so that we can't help project ourselves into these things. Rather, I think we should aim for AI that is maximally complementary to our own cognition, our own intelligence. And if we have that as a goal, then I think we'll be able to navigate these tricky waters much more carefully. And unfortunately, I know that a lot of people in Silicon Valley and in tech and here in India think very carefully and deeply about this, but to some extent there is this background desire to play God, to create things in our own image. And maybe if we create silicon artificial consciousness, we can even live forever by uploading ourselves into its pristine circuits when we die. And there's some kind of silicon rapture. It's a religion for people with no religion when you think of it like this. And I think that needs to be questioned and interrogated a bit more. These technologies are powerful and they can solve so many problems that we face, they don't need to be us.
Anil, you just said this about getting into a body. I just wanted to share with the audience that some of this just sounds outlandish, but President Biden actually, and we'll be talking to Avi Roy and Elena Sergeyeva about age reversal, but President Biden has created something called ARPA, which is like the DARPA, and he's hired a scientist called John Herbert, if I'm not mistaken, who's actually working on creating non-sentient human bodies so that, when people grow old, they can then entire body swap, Like you're having knee replacement and hip replacement, you could have body replacement, and that's what they're working on. Also using cells of young fetuses, or dead fetuses, to see whether the brain plasticity will accept that and, regenerate itself. So, when the former president of America is interested and sanctioning this with millions of dollars, we need to take it seriously, But that brings me back, Anil, to two quick questions. This thing about hallucination, it drove me mad for a long while. And actually, Adam Ghazali is sitting here, and he gave me the answer to your proposition. But I won't tell it right now. please explain to the audience, what do you mean when you say that we are living in a controlled hallucination? Is this real? Is it not?
It's real. It's real. It's
Okay,
definitely real.
thank you.
Like the glass on it. It's not falling off. You don't. It's a real object. So I mean, again, no words are perfect. When we use the word hallucination, typically, it typically means that we're experiencing something that's not there, that's not real, that it's internally generated somehow. And there's this tendency to think of hallucinations, or even things like dreams, as coming from the inside. But when we're not hallucinating, we experience things as they are. We just see objective reality through the transparent windows of our eyes and our ears and so on. And the reason I like the term, and it comes from somebody else, so I can pass the blame to other people. I didn't invent it. Is that there's a continuity between what we typically call hallucination and what we typically call perception. And any experience can fall somewhere along that continuum. Back to the basics, experience of color. You know, colors don't exist as colors out there in the world. There's just reflecting light. Our brain is needed to make sense of it. So when we see a color, we're simultaneously experiencing less than what's really there, because our eyes are only sensitive to roughly 3 wavelengths, but also more than what's there, because we experience millions of colors out of these 3 wavelengths. And when we look up at the sky and there might be fluffy clouds, you know, sometimes we can see faces or shapes in these clouds. It's another echo of a kind of hallucination. The brain is projecting patterns into things and seeing where those patterns grip.
True. But Anil, as I said with you earlier, and I'm, again, these are complex things to finish in such short conversations, but I think it's mystifying for everybody because these are just tricks of perception, and that's why we weren't...
No, they're not tricks of perception. They're fundamental to it. I think this is like, so people often get seduced by visual illusions too, right? Tricks of perception. And they're very helpful, but they can also be misleading. The real point is that all of our experiences are like that. It's not a trick, it's the thing itself.
Yeah. So that's what was so confusing, because I drove Anil mad saying, how come classical physics still works? How come we send rockets into the sky if all this is hallucination? And I was so perturbed by your theories that when we chatted with Adam Ghazali, I asked him the same thing. And I have to say, he gave me a wonderful solution to your problem, where he said that yes, all of this is real, and we are existing in it, and it's perception. But, adjacent to us, there's a bee that is also living in its own bee world, and the bee doesn't know that the Iraq war is going on, or that Anil and Shoma are sitting and discussing something, and it's contiguous with the bee's reality. It might see my hair as purple, it's not seeing it as black, and it does not know that the Gaza war is going on, but the Gaza war indeed is going on, and it's real, So that really helped me understand that there are infinite realities, and we are stuck in our own particular species-specific construct of that reality, which is it's hallucination because this is not blue and my hair is not black, Is that an accurate description?
It's a great description. And
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam. You've sorted it out. There's a great term from a German ethologist called Jakob von Uexküll, who talks about the Umwelt. And the Umwelt, the Germans have the best words for everything. The Umwelt is the sensory environment, the lived sensory experience that is species-specific. So the bee would have a different Umwelt to a human being, to an alligator, to a fish, and so on. But there is indeed, a shared objective reality underneath all of this. But we can never access it directly with our perception. It will only ever be indirect and constructed. I think an interesting extension of that, and this is something that we work on in my lab at Sussex, is that even within species, we can experience the world in actually remarkably different ways. We talk about neurodivergent conditions and so on. But even if we don't feel that we are neurodivergent, there's likely a lot of diversity among us all. After all, we all differ in body shape and size and so on. And that's easy to see. But if we have different inner experiences, it's much harder to recognize that because these experiences are private. Now, I can't tell what you're experiencing directly. And it also seems as though we see things as they really are. It doesn't seem as though you could see it differently. Do you remember that image of the dress
Yes.
There was blue and black or white and gold. I don't know if people remember this from about 10 years ago, this dress, and it was blue. I mean,
Viral, yes.
how many people saw it as blue and black?
Nobody
Not
saw
many.
the dress.
Nobody did not see it here.
You're a bee, you don't have a shared reality.
Okay, fair enough. But that really brought home that even within the population as a whole, we could have very, very different experiences. So one of the studies we're doing is really trying to map this out. How diverse are our inner worlds? You could say we live in sort of perceptual echo chambers just as much as we live in social media echo chambers.
So, last question, Anil. We're going to get on to the next session, and I think you can keep teasing Anil about these very difficult ideas that he puts out. Is that what is the therapeutic and spiritual value of what you're saying, Anil? When you say that the self is also just a web of perceptions coming together, then why should we care about the self? And then more importantly, what's the therapeutic value of this?
I don't want to overstate these things because it's going to be different for everyone. But I think there can be therapeutic potential, firstly because a lot of mental health challenges that people face really are best understood as alterations in their experience. We experience things in different ways, whether it's the body or the world. And the more we know about how perceptions are actually constructed, the more we're able to get at the mechanisms when we try to treat or diagnose mental health conditions rather than just suppressing the symptoms. Now, that's quite a long game, but even in the shorter term, I think there's a lot to be gained, and maybe this begins to come together a little bit with the spiritual. There's a lot to be gained in recognizing that at a very deep level, how things seem is not necessarily how they are. A lot of, I think, of our everyday challenges come from immediately leaping from how things seem to how they are. And the more we can bake in this recognition that there's an interpretation, how things seem is always an interpretation, and because it's an interpretation, there's context, there's flexibility. Mathieu Ricard, who's going to speak tomorrow, has done several billion hours of meditation, and I think gets to a place even more than this, of recognizing that experiences pass and they don't reflect things as they really are. I think it's getting to a similar place from a very different direction. And the last thing I'll say is that, it's back to the AI question. I think there's something deeply spiritually important here. We humans, we tend to project ourselves into our machine creations far too easily. And I think that is underlying a lot of the anxiety, the social anxiety about AI. And if we take a step back from that and recognize the differences between us and the machines we create, and how we are so much richer, biological systems, we're much more than meat-based computers going from one meeting to another. I think that will help us see ourselves more as part of nature and not apart from nature. And for me, anyway, that's a very spiritually important dimension.
Thank you very much, Anil. Thank you. I have to say, Anil has definitely given us a tool in our office. Now, when any of us don't agree on something, we say perceptual diversity, We just say, Anil Seth, and that's our tool for dissolving all conflict, So I hope Anil Seth proliferates in the world and becomes a shorthand phrase for disagreeing with people in a very peaceful way, So thank you very much, Anil, for being here. Thank you.